2003, we were there for 6 years. You obviously weren't Secretary of Defence for all that period, but you were there for a significant period afterwards. How did you find that you had continuing discussions, presumably, with the Chancellor about how you managed the budgetary position created by Iraq? How did you manage that process?
I think it's right to say that we did not have any difficulty at all in securing the extra spending specifically for the operations. The Treasury, I think, by then were used to the process that we'd been through in relation to Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, I guess prior to that in the Balkans. So the extra money for operational capability was available. I indicated earlier some difficulties over how you sustain some of that equipment thereafter.
But in terms of the extra funding for the actual operations, but we discussed earlier the relationship between the general defence budget and what is necessary for specific operations. What about that side of the equation? How successful were you in maintaining a defence budget to provide the core, the foundation for any future operations?
Well, as I indicated, when I arrived in the Ministry of Defence, there was a strong sense that the Ministry of Defence had been underfunded. I do not believe that that began in 1997. There was a strong sense that perhaps the so-called peace dividend had eaten too deeply into defence resources over a longer period of time, and that in a sense a strategic defence review was part of the process of trying to recover some ground, but albeit not as well funded as it could have been.
And so this is a continuing position you found yourself in. Were you able to improve the situation?
Well, certainly defence spending increased in the time that I was there. I dare say others in the department would question the extent to which it increased in the way that other departments' budgets increased, but nevertheless that there was extra spending available.
I think there was a particular disagreement with the Treasury in September 2003. Do you recall that?
I do.
Perhaps you could explain what it was about.
I'll try.
It is complicated.
It goes back actually to the settlement in July, I think it was, 2002. This is the complicated part. The Treasury were moving towards a system of resource account budgeting, which in a simplistic way meant that departments had to pay for existing equipment as well as new equipment, so that there was an amount allocated for what you already held. Now, for most departments, I suspect the two that were particularly affected by this were defence more than any other, but transport probably as well. For most departments, this was a means of, adopted from the private sector, of bearing down on historic cost, of using existing resources more efficiently and more effectively. What I think the Treasury probably overlooked in their settlement letter in July 2002 is that because of the large amount of equipment that the MOD held, it was much easier for them to bear down on those costs, and did so. It's one of the reasons why we judged the 2002 settlement as presented to us was very favourable, because we would be able to use our asset base far more efficiently and effectively to release cash for other spending.
So essentially what this meant is you could take the non-cash parts of the budget and transfer it across to the cash part.
Only subject to finding efficiencies. That means using the existing equipment more efficiently and therefore at a lower cost. And that was the whole point of resource account budgeting, was to, and adopted from the private sector, was to put pressure on departments to look much harder at their equipment, and if they had, for example, equipment that was no longer really fit for its purpose, to get rid of it, and if they had older equipment that was expensive and tying up a lot of maintenance time and money, make a tough decision as to whether you really needed it. But I think what the Treasury overlooked was that this gave enormous flexibility to the MOD to do precisely what you have just described. And about 15 months later, I think the Treasury realised that we were spending rather more than they thought we should because of this flexibility. And the flexibility was written into the settlement letter. I had read about this in the newspapers. I don't actually have a copy of the settlement letter, Sir John. I did ask for one, but it is not actually available. But nevertheless, I think it was clear what was happening. We were given this flexibility. The Treasury didn't like the fact that we were using the flexibility, and probably around 15 months later, they didn't put the brakes on. They told us we had to stop. Now, that caused quite a lot of problems because we'd been spending at this higher rate. And moreover, we had quite a lot of plans for future equipment based on the flexibility, because obviously this was something that would go forward as well as retrospectively. And we then...
I'm so sorry. Slow down a bit.
My apologies. We then had to... we had to look hard at our budget and make some rather difficult cuts in the future equipment programme as a result.
How was this argument played out? Because it was quite a challenge, not only to the budget, but to your role as the Chief Accounting Officer.
Well, I mean, there was a fair amount of correspondence, I think it's fair to say, in the immediate aftermath. I don't think this issue was resolved for quite a long time because we were clear as to what the settlement letter meant. One of the reasons why I had welcomed the settlement, because I thought that this opportunity was going to be available to us. The Treasury insisted that we should have some independent assessment of both the rules and of our spending. Probably Sir Kevin Tebbit is a better person to ask about this, but I'm pretty confident that we were vindicated, that the accountants brought in to look at this said that this was wholly consistent both with private sector practice and indeed with the rules that the Treasury had established. As I say, I think in their enthusiasm for applying these rules across the government, I think they slightly overlooked the benefit this brought to the MOD.
Now, lest this appear as a side issue, but part of one of the issues that was raised is whether the cuts or the reduction in your budget that would be expected of you would have any consequences for Iraq, for our capabilities in Iraq.
I mean, I don't think that is the case, in fact. The forward equipment programme was affected, but I doubt that would have had immediate consequences for Iraq, because this was I mean, we produced a white paper in the interim on, I'm sorry about the expression, but network-centric capability, and about ensuring that we could do all of the things that I was describing before the break to the Baroness, that we could operate at distance, that we had technology that we could rapidly deploy our forces. So this was about transforming our forces again to this kind of not just expeditionary warfare, but high technology warfare.
But given that we're in a conflict that seems to be lasting for longer than might have been anticipated, it is relevant in terms of, for example, helicopters, and looking forward to what you would be able to provide our forces in the future.
Well, again, I don't want to overstate the position. I don't believe that it was relevant to helicopters in Iraq. No doubt, I mean, this is going back to 2002, 3, 4. I suppose it's reasonable to assume that by now, had that budget have been spent in the way that we thought we should spend it, then those helicopters would probably be coming into service any time now.